Our next interview is with Owen Kubik from Dayton, Ohio. And Owen, just as I've asked everybody else, just sort of start out as a young man, work your way through your youth, the college, education, marriage, how you first got interested in books, your bookshop, etc., and just sort of ramble on, take us from the beginning up to now.
Sure. I probably first got interested in books as far as from a collecting standpoint because my parents were book collectors. They never dealt in books, but they collected books, and so I grew up in a household like that. When I was just a child in elementary school in Dayton, Ohio, I started collecting comic books. And then somewhere along the line, I started going to places, junk shops, thrift stores, where I would be looking for comic books for myself, and I wouldn't find anything I want, but I would see, hey, well, this is a scarce comic book, so I would buy it, and then I would sell it to a comic book dealer. And then I started selling comic books to other classmates of mine who were interested. So I think you can see that from a relatively young age, I had something in me where I was getting a kick out of this buying and selling things. I continued, that kind of grew, as I grew too old for comic books, I became interested in books and started collecting books. The first author who I started actively collecting was Albert Payson Terhune, the author of dog fiction from 19-teens, 20s, 30s. And I actually started building a comprehensive collection of his when I was in the 8th grade. I started being interested in first editions and points and autographs and things like that. And there was a bookseller in Philadelphia by the name of Kathleen Race, and she was actually the one who kind of took me under her wing and kind of taught me about what a first edition is and what all the particularities of the book trade. When I was in college, I started supplementing my income, such as it was, a little bit by buying and selling books, but it wasn't very satisfying because most of the stores in the Dayton and Cincinnati region were not at all interested in collectible books and not active buyers. I remember finding a real nice first edition of The Job by Sinclair Lewis, who was still more popular than he is today. This is in the 70s, and taking it to the old Acres of Books in Cincinnati, Ohio, and being told that, oh, well, nobody wants old novels, we'll give you a nickel for it. Well, I was...
Generously.
Yeah, so that made me realize, well, being a book scout is not the way to go, but actually what I was planning to do all through college was to go on to seminary and study for the Catholic priesthood. And so that's what I was actively working towards. But then when I graduated from college, the priests of the archdiocese in their vocation office who I was working with, suggested that it might be a good idea for me to, take some time off from, instead of just going straight on and continuing with intellectual studies, but to, take a little bit of a break. So that's what I did, and I thought, well, I'll probably go to the seminary in another year or a year and a half, and I need to do something, so, I'll start selling books. That'll be a way to pleasantly pass the time for a year or so. Well, let's see, that was 1985, and so now it's 24 years later.
And you're still not in the seminary.
Yeah, I never went to the seminary, obviously. I am married, happily so. But that's basically how I got into the book business. Realized that I had a knack for it. I started out as a specialist dealer. By this point in my life, I started collecting books on the British Empire and that whole range of Victorian warfare and India and Africa. So that was originally, I thought I was just going to be a specialist in that, but very quickly became more of a generalist, always trying to be a generalist more in the sense of a general dealer in better books. catalogs. Issued my first catalog in 1986. I had been in the business for 3 months. Was all of 21 years old, and started doing many book fairs. Learned about the ABAA from Larry Dingman. He was the first ABAA dealer who I met, and he kind of took me under his wing and started explaining to me more about the book trade and things like that. He was my sponsor for the ABAA, so I joined in 1990. Basically, at the time, you had to be a full-time seller for at least 4 years, and so as soon as my 4 years were up, I applied and was accepted. My other sponsors were Susan Heller from Cleveland and the late Bob Heyman from Cary, Ohio. So that is...
Have you always been in Dayton?
Pretty much always been in Dayton. I was born in Wisconsin and lived in Chicago. My father was at the University of Chicago, but when I was 9 years old, we moved to Dayton. And I've never left. I like the town, and I have deep roots in that town, and it's a good city. I now have as of 3 years ago, I now actually have my first open shop. So that's, everyone else in the world was closing, and I've always been kind of a contrarian, so I thought, well, if everybody else closes, then all the people will need somewhere to go, and so I thought maybe an open shop would work, and it's so far has worked well as being an opportunity to purchase material, still kind of getting established for selling.
The internet has been described by some of the booksellers as a friend, by others as a foe. What percentage of sales does it play? What part does it play in your business? How do you feel about it as an entity?
Sure. Well, the internet has been very important for us. We had a successful business, going as it was. The internet to me seems to, when online bookselling first started really becoming important to us, it's probably around 1998, 99, something like that. So we got involved with most of the sites fairly early. Because we were exclusively a catalog business, we had our entire inventory cataloged in a database, so it was very easy to just upload everything, going back to the days of there was Bibliosity, company that didn't make it, but from the very beginning we sold an awful lot on the internet. The internet has become a critical part of our business. I would estimate that currently the internet is probably about 80 to 90% of our business.
Wow.
A very substantial portion of the business, but we have developed it. What has the internet done? I don't know that I would necessarily describe it as friend or foe. It has forced us to adapt the way we do business, and it's forced us to change the way we do business, and that has both pros and cons. In the old days, let's say in the 1990s, our business model was essentially we were a specialist catalog seller in military history, and we did a lot of book fairs, and I had developed kind of a knack for what I would say, working different markets. I used to go over to England 2 to 3 times a year on buying trips because I could buy a lot of military history books that were priced much lower in Great Britain than they were priced in the United States, and so it was worth it to buy them there and bring them and sell them in the United States market. I also used to do very well at the book fairs because essentially what I would do is go to all the many small regional book fairs that we had in the Midwest At one time, Ohio alone had, I believe we counted up that there were 12 book shows every year, just in Ohio, not to mention Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Illinois, and the like. I would go to all these shows, purchase books from dealers, take them to shows, primarily ABAA shows, and be able to do well because there was a different type of book that would sell at ABAA show in a major city as opposed to what would sell at a small dealer in Lima, Ohio, or some other very small town. The internet obviously pretty much ended that. The internet, for the most part, changed the business, I think, most dramatically by ending the whole idea of going to small shops and finding the small dealers and finding the treasures. On the other hand, so that was negative in that sense, but on the other hand, the internet opened tremendous opportunities to sell to many people who we would not have sold to otherwise. We have a much, much higher percentage of our business is international now. We still issue catalogs, not as many. We used to issue 4 to 6 a year, and now we're down to 1 or 2 a year. But we do try to keep that part of the market active. The internet has certainly forced us as well to adapt the kind of books that we sell. We have a much broader range, and broader range not only in terms of the type of books, but also in the terms of the value of the books. We have found that at times, we buy books that at one time in our life we would have just disregarded, but now we buy them because even though they're not very expensive, they sell very quickly, and it's easy enough to just upload them and their cash flow.
I would consider you one of the younger booksellers in the association. I believe you're under 50?
I am 44.
Okay. You're in the minority as far as the association goes, age-wise. How do you see bookselling going along? There are so many of us who are in our 60s and 70s, and so few who are in their 30s and 40s. Do you think this bodes ill for the association and for the book business?
Well, that would be absolutely, and that would be my biggest concern about the trade at this point here in 2009. When I joined the ABAA in 1990, I was the youngest member of the association. So now here it is 19 years later, and while I am not the youngest member, I think I'm probably one of the 5 youngest members.
Yeah.
So we're not, we're not getting the people, coming in. Now, I understand that the book trade has always been something that people tend to turn to as a second career. They tend to turn to it later in life. So there may be enough people who continue to come into the association. But I certainly think there's a possibility that at some point there will not be a membership that is large enough to provide the critical mass that's needed to pay for our offices in New York, to pay for our website, to pay for the executive director's salary, and to pay for a directory, and whatever it may be. Yeah. So the ABAA may well have to scale down. And that's certainly, I think that is a big challenge.
What do you mean by scale down?
Well, scale down if we come to a point where there are not enough active members, then the ABAA may not generate enough income from membership dues to be able to continue to provide all of the services that it currently does. Now, I am not on the Board of Governors right now, so I don't know what budget issues or anything like that, but it just stands to reason that certain perks of membership may become expensive. Things may have to be cut.
I mean, we have about 450 or so members right now, and with this membership in this economy, they tell me that they cannot fund all the things that they want to fund. It would seem that if the membership were to go down, the likelihood of funding those things would go away as well.
Certainly, and possibly more things as well. We see book fairs. Book fairs are changing, and there may come a time when not as many book fairs are being held. Certainly, we've already seen that with the regional book fairs. Will we see a time when there's fewer ABAA book fairs? Well, it's conjectural, of course. Certainly, the Chicago Book Fair did not last. I was in charge of the last one that we did try to have, and it really didn't work out that well.
A big city like Chicago with a big population, and it still couldn't make it, huh?
And one of the reasons why it was always a challenge was that I think to have a successful book fair, you have to have an active membership, and that was part of the problem in Chicago. Is the Midwest is so spread out.
Right.
I mean, I was president of the Midwest chapter and chairman of the book fair committee, but I was about 300 miles from Chicago, so there's really not anything that I could do on a daily basis, and we contracted actually with Sandy Smith to have him run the fair for us, and Sandy, did a good job on his end, but it just didn't really work out.
As a young bookseller yourself, if other booksellers come to you and ask you, say to you something to the effect, "Gee, Owen, I'm thinking about becoming a bookseller," what kind of advice would you give them in this day and age?
Mm-hmm. Interesting question, because I'm not sure that I could really... I couldn't encourage someone to do it because they wanted to make a lot of money.
Well, yeah. Obviously.
So it would have to be... if they wanted to do it because they wanted to, if they had that passion, then what I would tell them to do is to, first off, to learn about the Internet. The Internet is here to stay. It's not going away. Mm-hmm. But to learn how to use it creatively, how to make it, your friend as opposed to your foe. And secondly, I would say to learn about a broad range of books. I think that the age of the specialist bookseller, the exclusively specialist bookseller, is passing, and I think that you need to have a greater knowledge of a wide variety of books. And lastly, not to get too caught up in the Internet as far as being the exclusive sales venue, because there are other ways to sell books other than the Internet, and book fairs are certainly one, and there's many other ways. So there are still creative ways to sell books, but outside the Internet, even though the Internet is an important tool.
As you progressed as a bookseller in the trade, who were some of the booksellers who you looked up to, who mentored you, who helped you, who answered questions? Name some of the people who were very helpful to you as a young bookseller.
Well, I've already mentioned Larry Dingman, who was my sponsor for the ABAA, and Larry helped get me started. I would say there's a number of people who helped me in different ways, but for whatever reason, I'd say probably Jeff Marks and Peter Stern and Jim Pepper all, took a liking to me, so to speak. Tom Congleton was another. Part of the, I would say with me personally, a lot of my experience in the ABAA has been defined by my youth. I was the youngest member, and people, tended to treat me differently. Some people treated me as a kid brother.
Right.
Some people who were older treated me as like a son, or even probably a grandson. Some people are very helpful. I have taken a tremendous amount of grief over the years as far as teasing.
Sure.
A lot of that has been because of my youth, and I did a lot of growing up in the context of the book trade. When I went to my first book fair out of town, which was a Baltimore book show in the spring of 1986, I had just graduated from college. I had never, I don't think I had ever stayed at a hotel without my parents. And so there's just so many things. My first airplane flight was to go to England, to buy books. So many things, in my life have developed because out of the book business, just a lot of things from the sacred to the profane, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so it's been very interesting. And there's a lot of people who have helped me with kind words, or it's just interesting how people will say something that has stuck in my head for many years, and not just about books, about people who've given me tips about marriage or children or life in general. So that's been a good thing.
Just lastly, before I let you go, what do you see as some of the challenges that we as booksellers face in the years to come?
I think the biggest challenge is going to be keeping the relevance of book collecting alive to the public. Obviously, there's a certain trend right now. There's a lot of people who think, books are passé. I don't believe that, but I certainly see how books are changing. I'm at an opportunity right now where I'm interacting quite a bit with young people, college-age people, college students, and I definitely notice differences there. They still respect books, but so many of their reading now and their research is online, and especially research. The idea of going to the library seems quaint to them because you do your research online. So I think keeping the book relevant, and I think especially in the digital age, there's going to be certain things that people will not understand as well anymore. I think a perfect example of that would probably be fine printing, because people aren't even going to understand about things like lead type or whatever it may be. In additions, things like states, that's a kind of a weird sort of thing in the digital world. Yeah, so I think there's going to be some things that are very traditionally part of the book trade that we're going to see people are just not really relating to and not caring as much about anymore. While they still may care about books, it may be for different reasons and in a different way, and that's all right. But the challenge is going to be, I think, more to adapt ourselves and not to be curmudgeon-y old dinosaurs who's like, this is the way I've always done it and I refuse to change.
Great. Thanks a lot for sharing 30 minutes with us, Owen.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.